This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guests today are the people behind a fascinating new exhibition that opens this week at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute and will run until the end of November. This photo exhibition, The Last Folio, is dedicated to the Jewish Pompeii of Slovakia. Since 1942, time has stood still across the Central European country, where the Jewish community remained intact in every respect except one, its people, only a few of whom survived the Holocaust. Dilapidated books, synagogues, cemeteries and Jewish life, 70 years on, are the focus of Yuri Deutsch's works. He's now joining me here together with Katya Krausova, the curator of the show. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting us.
Wonderful to be here.
Okay, Yuri, let's start with you. You discovered this treasure trove of Jewish history in Slovakia almost by chance when you returned to your native Slovakia for your father's funeral. Tell us how it happened exactly.
Well, the treasure we discovered together with Katya. Before I met Katya, I was working on a project of portraits, black and white portraits of Holocaust survivors. And I was into it for a while when we organized a reunion of all the Slovak and Czech Jews in Bratislava in 2005. I was asked by organizer to do a slide presentation of the portraits I'd done till then. And I was not really happy to do that because there was such a festive atmosphere. And around 10 o'clock, they asked me to present my part. And I tried to actually get out of it. But they said it took us so long to get projected that you better do it. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that because there's so many serendipitous circumstances on this project that this is one of them. Katya happened to be in the room because she was one of the people at this reunion. And after she saw the picture, she approached me and asked me if I would be interested to do some small movie or film about this project.
About the people?
About the people.
Mm-hmm. And then from there, how did it get to all these books and places of worship and community institutions that feature in the exhibition?
We decided to do a little film in 2005. I really had the idea that we would visit some of the many people that Yuri photographed. I was very moved by the portraits. Although I didn't know any of the people he photographed, it felt like they were all my people. And when I approached him, I said, I don't really mind who we interview. Let's just see how many stories we can gather. And it took some time to get the team together and to get the finances together. And so about 5 months later, we started. And during the very first day, it became quite clear that those people have been sitting there waiting for us. It was their last moment. It was their 5 minutes to midnight. And if they didn't tell us, there was never going to be anybody to hear their story. And it gave such an urgency to us that we decided at the end of the first 10-day trip that we would come back. And then it took another 6 months for me to raise the money. And in March of 2006, we were in a small town all the way on the Polish-Ukrainian border called Bardziejów. And that is where, by, as Yuri mentioned, serendipity has been a kind of password of this project. We met a couple who, after we photographed them, we had left them, and in the building they lived in a ugly 50s communist housing block. a man and his wife approached us and tried to kind of assure us that they were all right and that they had something they wanted to discuss, and could we come and visit them in their flat. And we were not that desperate because it was a long day and we had more to go to the following day. And we went to their flat and they asked if we wanted to have a drink. And the man took out of his cupboard a bottle of Slivovitz, which said on the label 1936, kosher for Passover. And I think that was the moment when this project took a completely different route, because then we were very curious. I had earlier said to the man that we had no time because there was an 80-year-old 300 kilometers away and there was a lot of snow on the roads and I couldn't go late. I couldn't, having encouraged this man to remember things that were very painful, I couldn't just leave him and say, well, actually, we won't come tomorrow, we'll come another day. So that's why we were not that keen to go, but having seen this, it became quite obvious that there was something very special, and very special it was. We walked in and we did not move for 8 hours. And Yuri and the cameraman were completely transposed. They simply couldn't believe what you call the treasure trove.
Yeah. Yuri, when you went in, what was it that you saw? What was so special about that treasure trove?
The books were magical. I read a lot about the word beauties. I was a commercial photographer for 40 years, and what is beauty was something always foremost on my mind. But when I saw those decomposed books, I saw enormous beauty in them, and somehow attachment to past. So I photographed them, but I really didn't get it. I came home to Canada, I looked at them again, and I called Katya. I said, listen, I have to go back. There's something in these books which I have to get out, and I don't have it yet. And that was beginning of many journey back to the books. And of course, later it's enlarged to another spaces, because when I mentioned to my friends, Jewish friends from Slovakia, that I'm doing this project, they suggested another treasure of books in another towns.
And that's how it expanded to cover all of Slovakia, essentially.
Well, it's expanded this way and expanded another way because Katya happened to have a book on her, which I never really looked into. And she was, every time we passed some town, she would say, by the way, in my book, it says that there's a synagogue somewhere in this town. And sure enough, there was.
And the other important thing about that story is that it was a book that my parents had sent me, and I never paid any attention to it. It was a book which was a reference book, probably the only reference book, about Jewish communities in Slovakia. And when was
it written?
It was written, well, it was published in the post-Berlin Wall. And when I took it out of my bag, because I brought it with me, I had not ever looked at the name of the author, and the author was Yuri's father.
So this is a very personal journey for you, Yuri, isn't it?
Well, it was journey of discoveries, find out finally who I am, where I come from, and by where I come from, not the country, but the people. Being born in communist country, the religion was not really part of our life. And I mean not religion, but even the customs. Occasionally I caught my father praying, but I really didn't understand what he was doing. Now I know that he have a talis and he have a kippah, but frankly, as a 16-year-old, I didn't know what it is.
But your father was virtually the only historian of Jewish Slovakia, yet you didn't grow up in a Jewish home in any way?
Well, you have to understand, I left in 1968. Till then, my father was was a director of a community college. And as such, he had to be member of Communist Party. And religion was not, or our past was not topic we would engage in. He became head of community only after I left, because he was sacked from his job because he signed petition against invasion. And then he worked as
the Soviet invasion in 68.
68. And then he worked as a volunteer in museum when he was actually gathering all this information about communities.
And he didn't do it out in the open, did he?
No, he was doing it secretly, with note from the director who knew what was my father up to. Later I found the director was half Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Katja, how did the books and the synagogues and all these remnants survive the twists and turns of 20th century Slovakia, first the Second World War, and then the communist regime? You would expect them to disappear, yet they were all there.
I think that was completely by chance. It was a building that somehow escaped the usual ransacking, which is what we saw when we visited numerous synagogues which had been used as storage, or they were the usage was changed. Some of the finest buildings we found were used for silage or for chemicals, and the beautiful Košice synagogue, which is one of our iconic photographs in the exhibition, was very lucky it escaped because it was used as a book repository. Mm-hmm. So that was, I suppose, a good fortune in all the bad fortune. But the answer to this particular Bardejov collection of books is that it didn't matter to anybody. The property had been looted during the Second World War. Majority of Jewish property was taken over with the blessing of the Slovak state, the Slovak president. In my documentary, I have the section of the speech of the president at the time, who said that it was the Christian obligation of every single Slovak to destroy its mortal enemy, the Jew. If you have a president who tells you that, you basically have a carte blanche to take over anything you like. So this particular building was just unbelievably lucky. Mm-hmm. There was no furniture in it worth taking, and the man who looked after it after the war and who went and prayed there every day somehow managed to keep a kind of control over this one building. The other building, the one where we were lucky enough to find Yuri's grandfather's book, that was a different story. There, the case was that the Communist Party secretary decided to destroy the synagogue overnight to avoid any protest. This is already in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm. Protest from whom? From the locals?
From the locals, because it was a beautiful building. The Michalovce synagogue was one of the great architectural treasures of Jewish architecture in that part of the world. And what was really special there was that it was the locals who, in the night, collected everything they could carry out of the synagogue and brought it into a private house. So when we were given the keys to the house, there were thousands of books, literally thousands of books, and the sitting room was turned into a prayer room. It had part of the bima. So, again, another bit of extraordinary good fortune.
Mm-hmm. Yuri, you discovered completely by chance a book that had the signature of your grandfather in it while you were going through some of the books that you were photographing. Did you know about your grandfather's past in that specific place, or did it come as a complete surprise to you?
Okay, I have to explain what actually happened. It was Katja who noticed that each book had a stamp, and in the stamp there was a name, place, and a profession. And as I was working on something totally different, Katja was putting her books on the floor, and she was building a whole town or all community of Jewish professions on the floor. So they would have a stamp from different towns in different languages, Slovak, Russian, German. And she was puzzled and she was intrigued by some profession. She would talk loudly and she would say, "Oh my God, look at this. This guy have exotic sweets in this tiny little village." And then she suddenly came to me and she was building this imaginary little town. And she says, "By the way, we never talk about your grandparents." Now, I didn't even realize really that the town we are in is the town where my grandparents came from. Because
you knew it though,
well,
in the back of your...
back of my head, but I wasn't paying attention to it because it wasn't really important, and because I never met them, and because I was not looking for anything which belongs to them. That was the last thing on my mind. But Katya says, by the way, she asked me, what was your grandfather name? And I said, as far as I remember, it was Jacob. And she said, what profession was he? I think it was a tailor. What kind of tailor? I said, come on, is that important? She said, in this case, it's actually quite important. So I said, yeah, he was a ladies' tailor. And she said, well, look what I found. And here it was, Jacob Deutsch, ladies' tailor, Michalovce. I look at the book, and then I noticed the book was given to him by Goldschmidt family, which was my father's uncles. It was beyond any doubt that this book belonged to us. I mean, my heritage.
It's incredible that it survived all these trials and tribulations.
Well, it's a miracle that she found it.
Yeah, that too. I want to ask you about your personal stories as well as that of the entire Slovakian Jewish community. Very few survived the Holocaust, yet they decided to go back and build their lives in the new Czechoslovakia. Why did they not go elsewhere, namely to Israel?
Well, I will say my part, and Katya will say another part, because this is sort of a question for both of us. Why didn't they go back? Many of them were they were intellectuals, and they were simple people. Intellectual like my parents, and I think Katya's parents, they actually naively thought that they're going to build a new, just society. Another people who came from small villages, they really didn't have any idea of the outside world. Those who did have a relative somewhere else left, and I would say the majority left. But those who stay, each of them have their own personal reason, and we would have to go and ask them, each of them, and it would be a different story. In my parents' case, I was puzzled for years, and now I think that maybe it was a fate. Maybe it was a fate that my father had to stay and write the book about Jewish community. I have no other explanation.
You never talked about it at home?
I tried to ask them many times, actually, after the communism collapsed. And my father was always quiet, and he shrugged his shoulder, and he couldn't really come with the answer. Which I think is as well, because what can you say?
What about your family, Katya?
In my case, it was actually quite different. And one of the things which is so interesting about this whole journey that we had gone through is that on the whole, everybody thinks, well, there is a handful of children of Jewish survivors, and they are all the same. Our stories could not be more different from each other. My parents were very committed Zionists and very committed communists. I have often been asked how those two things go together. Apparently they go together very well. In the history of the Jewish left wing, it's always gone together. And my parents, indeed, like you mentioned, they wanted to stay and build a better Czechoslovakia. I think that my father was quite tempted to come to Israel. Part of, well, the only surviving member of my family is now living in Jerusalem, my uncle. And he came here as a young man. I think that my parents really wanted to stay and be part of that future that unfortunately never happened. My father ended up in prison for 9 years as a Zionist. So in his case, this was a very clear answer. But I think for us, when we got to the age when we started to wonder about it, and we were on the whole all under pressure from our parents to leave, which was also interesting. So they brought us up to be there, to be patriotic, but at the same time to know that if there is an opportunity and the borders open, we must leave.
Right. I want to take it to a whole different topic and ask you, Katya, as the curator and the producer of the exhibition. It is an international exhibition. It's shown all around the world. And my question to you is how difficult was it to adapt it to a somewhat blasé Israeli audience. We're sitting just a couple of miles from Yad Vashem, where dozens, if not hundreds, of not similar or parallel stories are showcased. What were you doing to try and make that particular amazing story stand out?
Difficult. Difficult indeed, but it's a little story that says so much because it focuses on books. And we are all extremely attached to books. This is not just Jews, the people of the book. This is a universal story of people seeing a book in need and feeling very emotional about it, and it brings out whole other stories about what cultural memory is about. What we've tried to do, what Yuri tried to do, was, I think, to take portraits of books, like he took portraits of people, and each book is photographed as an individual survivor, which is what those books are. So I think that makes it different. We've been with this exhibition around the world to many, many places. Currently we have an exhibition in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and we've been in Washington, and we've been in Moscow, and we've been in Berlin. So we've been to many of the kind of historically, politically important places. And what touches people every time are the stories behind the books, but the books themselves, the actual piece of paper that has decayed and what it represents.
Yuri, do you have a special favorite, one picture that you're particularly attached to?
Well, of course, picture of my father, which was the first picture on the whole project. I have incredible feeling because it have a kernel of the whole idea. And I would just like to add what Katja said about this exhibition, that we are second generation. There was a first generation, mostly represented Holocaust in literature. It was Elie Wiesel, it was Primo Levi, and many, many others who, they were first generation, they were the one who Holocaust impacted most. We are second generation. And there will be third generation, there will be fourth, and I think Holocaust will be passed from one generation to another. It's inevitable. It's part of our heritage. It's part of who we are as a people, and we will never forget that, of course. So, in this second generation, visual art, it's not represented as much as literature was on the first generation, and I was keenly aware of that. As my father was keenly aware that if he doesn't write a book about Jewish communities, that whole thing will be gone.
Yeah.
So there's maybe something in us Jews to keep the flame on.
Yeah, absolutely. And as part of the exhibition, there's also a film, other than the photos themselves.
We have a documentary. I had worked in parallel with Yuri, partly to document his story and partly to document the journey and partly to talk to the people who he had originally photographed. And so we have, as part of the project, nearly 100 hours of material, out of which the visitors to the exhibition can see a 20-minute version, which has Hebrew subtitles and has English subtitles, so hopefully all the visitors will have a chance to get to know the story and get to know Yuri as a photographer and to hear some of the stories of the survivors. And we never wanted to focus on what actually happened during the war. We had focused on how you survive and how you live on, and that's really important, that it is a positive message.
Absolutely. All right, Yuri Deutsch and Katja Krausova, the people behind the new exhibition and the film The Last Folio, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And the exhibition is showing at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute starting this week until the end of November. I'd like to thank the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
לא יודע איך לומר לך אני סתם בחור ששר לה